Hello, this is an interview for the HIWD 375 BO1 taught by Professor Ritchie. My name is Christian Kessinger and this is Bill Bailey. He is a Vietnam vet, and I just have a few questions. So, do you have anything to say before we get started, sir?
No, CJ, I look forward to talking to you about my whole experience in the military.
Yes, sir. So I have a few questions. What branch of service did you serve in, and what was your rank?
Okay, I was in the Navy. I was in naval aviation. I was a naval flight officer. I was in flying the F-4 Phantom aircraft.
Oh, nice.
I attained the rank of commander, which is
Wow.
05, which is the same as a lieutenant colonel in the other services.
Wow. All right. And then, why did you pick the service branch you joined?
Two major reason is that at the time I joined, with only 2 years of college, I could get into the aviation program and receive orders to a unit flying as an aviator.
All right. And did you just?
And I only had 2 years, a little over 2 years. I was out of money, ideas, and girlfriends. So
Oh, okay.
looked at naval aviation as an option.
All right. Perfect. And then, tell me about your training experiences.
At that time, you went through pre-flight, which was 4 months down in Pensacola, Florida.
Yes, sir.
4 months of ground school, marching, fundamentals of aviation. That we had Marine Corps drill sergeants, and it was very similar to what you would imagine any boot camp would be from that aspect of it. No flying. Then we went through a basic naval flight officer school, which again was about a month and a half of ground school, more principal of flight, a few hours of flight at that time, I think maybe 20 hours of flight time. And you selected, at that time, the options of what kind of aircraft you wanted to fly. You may or may not get the type of aircraft you wanted to fly. At that time, I selected the Grumman A6 two-seat attack aircraft. I was assigned to the fighter community instead of the attack community and received orders to train as a naval flight officer, specifically a radar intercept officer. Behind me you can see a picture of a carrier. That's a carrier that I was on when I was shot down. We'll cover that a little bit later.
Yes, sir.
But I flew off of aircraft carriers for 2 different Westpac cruises before I was shot down over North Vietnam in 1967. As again, we'll cover that. So following that training in Pensacola, I went to training in Glencoe, Georgia for about 4 months as a naval flight officer, flying multi-place aircraft, learning specifically how to fly intercepts primarily. Then I went to the West Coast to a replacement training group squadron where I spent about 6 months flying F-4s before I went to what was called a fleet squadron, Fighter Squadron 143. So that was a little, about a year and a half of training before I wound up in the fleet squadron. I spent nearly a year in that squadron before we deployed for my first overseas assignment.
Wow.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna ask, so you had a lot of training.
I was fortunate in that there were people who went immediately out of the replacement training air group squadron to combat.
Mhm.
For example, when I went through, I was teamed up with a fellow by the name of Ralph Gaither, and we were scheduled to go to the same squadron together.
Yes, sir.
But he switched orders. He was able to switch orders with another fellow who was also going through training, who was married and wanted to stay out on the West Coast in San Diego. We were being trained at what later became the home of Top Gun, Naval Air Station Miramar.
Oh, wow.
So that's fairly well famous as a location. He switched orders with this guy. He went to the East Coast, immediately joined a squadron that was deploying to Vietnam, and he was shot down in October of 1965. Whereas I made 2 cruises before I was shot down in June of 1967. So,
I was
yes, I was well trained, relatively speaking.
I was gonna say, you know, with just all that experience and just going through that kind of training, what got you through that training? Was there anything specific?
Well,
or-
it was. There were times it was difficult. The instructors tried to make it hard. They wanted to make sure that you did not crack under stress, I guess you'd call it. And there were people who washed out. I had a number of friends who we dropped on request, DOR, dropped on request. Since all of this was volunteer and we were not drafted,
Mhm.
so anytime you couldn't hack the program, you could drop on request and go somewhere else. One of the ironies of life is that a friend of mine by the name of, well, I won't use names, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, he dropped on request and he became the public affairs officer at Naval Air Station Miramar, where I was at. And about 6 months after he dropped, he was in a helicopter that crashed and he perished from burns. So I've always thought of the irony of 2 people that I knew well. One I was scheduled to fly with, who got shot down, became a POW 2 years, nearly 2 years before I did, because he just switched orders. And one guy who dropped out of the flight program and then was killed in an accident flying helicopters. So flying is a dangerous profession any way you look at it.
Yes, sir. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. So talking about, you know, your you know, during the war, did you understand your mission in Vietnam?
I understood it as was stated at that time. I did not question that mission at that time. There's 2 things. One, at that time, you have to realize that I was a 23, 24-year-old during the time I was flying. I just turned 23 on my first cruise. Just turned 24 on my second cruise. And I love flying. And combat flying is, I'm not a war lover, but combat flying is exhilarating, you know. And I was stupid. I had no wife, had no kids at home. I wasn't particularly worried about anything, and I had a little bit of the attitude that it always happens to the other guy, and that's a typical attitude. You can't fly with self-doubt. You have to be confident in your ability to fly and that sort of stuff. And I was, and I was pretty good. The commanding officer selected me to fly with him, so he could have had his choice of any of the NFOs to fly. And when I eventually got shot down, he and I were leading a strike, air wing strike of all the people in the not all the people, but it was a combined strike of about 20 aircraft from the aircraft carrier. So we had to attack people and the fighters, and we just happened to get very unlucky and got shot down with probably an 85 millimeter gun. As I say, we were leading a strike on North Vietnam when that happened. June 28th is coming up, anniversary is coming up right around the corner, June 28th, 1967.
So, did you feel that your mission or sense of purpose was fulfilled? If so, why or why not? I guess you kind of...
Well, at that time, there was some frustration on my part, and typically, the military people, generally speaking, shared a sense of frustration that the targets that we had were not worth our efforts. We spent many missions dropping bombs on dirt roads, which did very little damage. But 2 hours after we left, they filled in the holes and were ready to go again. But we did that because we had not received orders to go after higher value targets. And in reality, there weren't that many high-value targets in North Vietnam of a military nature.
Mm-hmm.
One time, there was a comment by a very famous Air Force general named Curtis LeMay. He was the father of the Strategic Air Command, SAC. And he says, if you just give me the words, we'll bomb them back to the Stone Age. Well, from a certain sense, they were in the Stone Age, technology-wise, the Vietnamese were, and we were fighting a war that was not a high-tech war. They were guerrillas living in the middle of the South Vietnamese. They were fighters who were able to function
Mm-hmm.
on just a few pounds of rice a week, basically, and they didn't require a lot. There wasn't a lot we could do. So it was a gross misuse of air power when you got down to it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was felt that anything we could do to contribute to reducing the infiltration of men and supplies to South Vietnam would help in the ground war in South Vietnam. And that's true. And it's just that it was very expensive and very ineffective.
Mm-hmm. Yes. What would you have done differently in terms of the mission and its parameters?
Well, if I were had been in charge of the mission, I would have earlier gone after the higher value targets. It took us 3 years of bombing before we were allowed to go after the supply facilities at the port of Haiphong and the facilities within the greater Hanoi area. Those are the two major cities in Vietnam. So the Vietnamese had for nearly 4 years from the time we first started bombing up North Vietnam, certainly 3 years, they had a large area that was off limits to bombers, in which they could gather the supplies, put them together, and started moving them to South Vietnam. So I would have done that earlier.
Okay.
But again, strategic-wise, as I say, I think we should have gotten out of Vietnam much earlier, because it became obvious that it was going to be a long haul to even reach a stalemate to most people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, most military people, on the other hand, are trained to fight, and we want to fight. I mean, that's our mission, you know, we want to win, and there is an inherent tension between the mission-oriented military and a civilian leadership that's looking at more than just a military victory. They're looking at the overall picture, all of it, not just the results on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it became obvious to most people by a couple of years after I was shut down, by then, that the Vietnam was not part of the expansionist policy of the Soviet Union or China. And the other part of that is that prior to that time, we viewed communism as a monolithic movement, and China and the Soviet Union as being inseparable, when in fact the Soviet Union and China had their own difficulties and did not act in concert very often. They had their own set of specific objectives, and one of the genesis of one of the things that rose President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who was Nixon's Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, recognized was that they could drive a split, help widen this movement between, or this rift between China and the Soviet Union, and that's when there was the first visits to China by Kissinger, and eventually it's hard to believe today, but there was a time when China was seen as completely hostile and completely isolated by most of the people in the United States and the Western world. And to be fair, the Chinese were also looking that way to most of the Western world too.
Oh, really?
Yes, under their great leader, Chairman Mao, they basically saw the West as decadent and as their mortal enemy.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to look at, in the greater shift of things, the history movements, you have to look at China had a movement away from that, which is far too complex to get into this, but there was the Cultural Revolution in China, in which the leadership under Mao set up a system of basically we're going to purge of anybody who's educated and thinks of global, and that they sent them all to the farms to work, or killed the people, most of them. And after that, they out of that, a very, very different China emerged as a reaction to this view. A China emerged that was looking to contact with the West and ideas, and it became the China that we know today, which is a world's leader in commerce, etc., etc. But going back to Vietnam, that was not so, especially in the early years of the conflict, which it can basically be seen as starting in 1961 with our first advisory that went in. It really didn't heat up until '64 when we started losing hundreds of people killed in '64, '65. And we went to the point where in '67, '68, we had over 10,000 Americans being killed each year in Vietnam. It's hard to understand for someone your age who has not been through that type of situation, where we get very, very upset, and rightly so. When we have, I guess maybe 1,000 people we had at the height of the wars in Iraq. I think maybe in the worst year we had over there, I doubt we even had 1,000 people killed, which is, it's a bad situation. And but again, you got to look at everything. Every situation is different. The Vietnam situation did not evolve into what the worst case scenario, which would have been North Vietnam came in, took over, and killed 1 million or so South Vietnamese. It did not. The North Vietnamese, they did take a few people and put them in re-education camps, and I think they killed a few of them very, very antimately people. But most of those people got out. Most of those people fled South Vietnam ahead of the North Vietnamese coming in. So there wasn't that great purge or bloodbath that a lot of people thought when the North Vietnamese took over. And today, North Vietnam is seen by the U.S. as one of our strategic allies to check the influence of China. Mm-hmm. And rightly so. They do not like the Chinese. They accepted Chinese aid during their conflict with America as the lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
Anyway, so complex situation.
Yeah, definitely. What other experiences did you have in the Vietnam War?
Well, I guess one of the things we get to talk about that is, and the immediate thing is, I was on my 182nd mission when I was shot down over North Vietnam. It was not the first time that I'd been, my aircraft had been shot up to some extent, but that particular mission, we were leading the strike going in against, we were flak suppression, and we got hit before we got there. I said we, I always use the term we because we were a two-man crew, and the commanding officer, Bill Lawrence, and I were flying together that cruise. And we always did that. We flew as the same crew. It's small things, but you got to know each other, and if if you were different people, you never react the same way. Anyway, so we were flying together, and we were approaching our target and got hit, and managed to still make our ordnance delivery, and the aircraft lost all of its hydraulics fluid as we were pulling out from our bomb run, and it went into a spin. It was uncontrollable, and we ejected from the airplane, and we were captured immediately. We were right on the outskirts of, I guess, the third largest city in Vietnam is called Nam Dinh, in the Red River Valley, and we were captured immediately. We came down to a rice paddy right on the edge of a little ville hamlet there, and there were 15, 20 Vietnamese waiting for me as I came down in the parachute, and then another 15 to 20 they were running out across the rice field to capture Bill Lawrence, who was he hit the ground maybe 20 seconds before I did, but I could see that from my chute as we were doing it, and we were capturing people, taking Hanoi that night. And thus started 5 years and 8 months as a POW.
That's was there anything that got you through that? I know that's definitely a hard.
Yeah. I think one of the first things that I would say in answering that question is that there is perhaps no single thing, but eventually the best thing is that I had a lot of pride and faith in the country. After I got in contact with my fellow POWs, it was the camaraderie and change between us. But I was in solitary confinement for 6 months, so the first 6 months I had no sustained contact with other Americans. And clandestinely, every now and then, I might just be able to whisper their name or something to the guys that were passing by the door where I was at or something like that. But the Vietnamese stayed in close contact with us, and they did not let us do that. When I moved in, when they moved me in with 2 other guys after 6 months, they taught me something called a tap code, which I did not know, and I had not been able to pick up. But a tap code was just a method of tapping on the walls and using a code, and you could pass information slowly, but you could pass information even though you might be in a concrete cell block and somebody else was 2 feet of concrete away. But that was the lifeline of the POWs, the tap code, being able to do that. And if, for your interest, if you can just visualize the alphabet in columns and rows, and take the letters C and K, and they're interchangeable. So you got 25. So any combination of 1 through 5 repeated by 1 through 5 will give you a letter. For example, my B, Bill Bailey. B would be, it's on A, B, C, D, E. That would be one row going out, A, B, C, D, E. So it's one of those. So it would be 1. And it's the second one on it, A, B. So it's 2. So that's a B. A C would be, and so on. So you got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. H is three letters on the second one. So it'd be 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. You could do that. And I'm rusty. I can't do it right now. I have to think about it. But after we practice and get on this, you can do it about as fast as this. Now, this is not wrong. And that would be Bailey. So you could really pass message. Those are the things that got me together. I'm often asked, in particular, I think it's appropriate I should cover the subject of religion. At the time, I would consider myself agnostic, not an atheist, but not a Christian. Religion had no role in my, no conscious role. It may have had a role that I didn't know about, but as far as I was concerned, it wasn't something that I thought God got me through this ordeal.
Did your military experience influence your thinking about the war, or about the military in general?
Probably. I'm not sure exactly where to go with that question. My military experience was an experience of more than anything else flying. It was not, up to this point, it was not an experience about thinking about the nature of war, the nature of country, the nature of anything else. It was simply a matter of teaching me how to fly, drop bombs, fire missiles, and fly an aircraft, and navigate, and all those things that go with that. Later, one of the things I really wanted to do was find out those bigger questions. And I eventually went to the Naval War College for a year where, among other things, you do think about the nature of war. You have case studies about the conflicts that occurred throughout the history of warfare. And they start off with the Greek wars, the conflict between Troy and Helen, and that sort of stuff. So yes, they did influence my views of the war, but I also went back and got civilian. I got an undergraduate degree in political science and history, and a graduate degree from Georgetown in formation of national security policy. So those subjects were very, very of very much interest to me. They were on top of mind. Why were we here? What do we do? Mm-hmm. And as I say, the conclusions I've come to is that I didn't see how we could avoid getting into Vietnam, but I think we should have been able to get out a lot earlier than we did. I think we could have saved thousands and thousands of lives and billions of dollars, and it had the same outcome as we eventually had anyway.
Yeah. So would you say that although it didn't influence it right there and then, it kind of like piqued your interest to kind of explore it a little later in life?
That's pretty good statement. Yeah.
All right, perfect. And then, how did your participation in the war impact your life afterward?
Very, very much so, because of the unique position of being an ex-prisoner of war. Mm-hmm. I think it impacted my life far more than if I had not been a prisoner of war. Again, that was 5 years and 8 months as a POW. My whole outlook on life was changed. I enjoyed things that I took for granted before, but I must admit that a lot of that wore off as the years rolled by. You don't have that same level of appreciation after you've experienced a good life as you do when you first start experiencing a good life after confinement like that.
Yeah. You also talked about, meeting your wife afterwards.
That was an interesting aspect of this confinement. While we were POWs, a group started getting together and putting out bracelets that had the POWs' names on them. Mm-hmm. And these were called MIA POW bracelets. And they did that to raise the Americans' sense of conscience about the fact that we had Americans who were missing in action and were POWs, and that the North Vietnamese were being extremely secretive about the fate of these people. In wars past, World War II, for example, generally speaking, especially in Europe, it was POWs were allowed to correspond from back and forth. There was international Red Cross efforts to facilitate that sort of stuff. But the Vietnamese, for the most part, 95% of them or more of the POWs were not allowed to write home or communicate or do anything or receive any communications from home and stuff. So that was the effort that this group had to try to get the Vietnamese to make some sort of acknowledgement of the fate of these missing, at that point, missing people. And my wife, now she's my wife, at that point, she was flying as a flight attendant with Pan American Airways. She saw people wearing these, asked what they were, and they explained much as I've just explained what they were. And she sent off for, I think she said it was $2.50 to this group. She got one, and it happened to have my name on it, Lieutenant James Bailey. And she contacted the group that did it, said, "Can you tell me about the Lieutenant James Bailey a little bit?" And she wasn't aware that there were very many people that had these. Anyway, the group sent it on to my mother. And I had not been married when I was shot down. I was not married. And my mother had received numerous requests for information as far as stuff concerned. So she replied to Susie and said, Lieutenant James Bailey is single, he's from blah, blah, blah.
Was she trying to get you set up with
Well,
something?
yeah, probably. Yeah, anyway, and Susie got that, and then when I got home, she sent a telegram back to my parents saying, "Welcome home," and we got in contact later. And that was in February of '73 when I was released. I met her in late June of '73. It took me that long to get to Europe, where at that time she was flying out of London. And a couple of weeks later, we were engaged, and we got married in November of that year. So I guess I can say that being a POW got me a wife out of it.
The little things with that one. Is there anything else you would like to add that we didn't cover in the interview?
I would simply say this: I consider it a privilege and an honor to have served our country, and I think that our country is in spite of the mistakes we made, and I think there's some of that, we have, generally speaking, always had the better interest of the world in our mind whenever we committed particular acts. And not always, and I can think of some exceptions that were simply spawned by our greed. For example, I think our treatment of the Native Americans is pretty much a little authoristic in our attitude of the government. But our government reflected the people. That was the attitude of the people towards Native Americans in the 1800s and the 1700s and 1900s. And anyway, the thing that I often say is it's Albert, I can't remember who he is, it's one of the famous European thinkers. The American system of the girl is the worst system in the world it can come up, democracy, except for all the rest. And it's true. It's the best thing that's got going. We don't have to build walls to keep people in the United States. And we have some people who are building walls to keep people out of the United States. They don't want to build walls, but we should always be a country that has a bright, shining beacon to the rest of the world. And I think we always will.
Well, hey, thank you so much, Mr. Bailey. Thank you for your service, and have a great Father's Day.
Thank you, C.P.